emotional intelligence is the best investment anyone can do as they're in sales, if they want to get into sales.
Hello Sales Nation and welcome to the Salesman Podcast Live in partnership with HubSpot Sales and here at the Revenue Summit in San Francisco. On today's show we have Daniel Barber. He's the VP of Sales over at Datanize. On today's show he's sharing why Sales Nation, you guys, me as well, why we need to become consultants in sales and not be pests over the long term if we really want to thrive. You can find out more about Daniel in the show notes to this episode over at salesmanpodcast.com. And with all that said, let's jump in to today's show. Daniel, welcome to the Salesman Podcast Live.
Thank you.
I'm excited to have you on, mate. I'm excited to dive into a topic that I think doesn't get enough coverage. I think it's almost a difficult one to talk about because it's difficult to define. Well, I think it's difficult to define what we're going to define. I'm sure you're going to have some insights and you're going to give us a whole bunch of value on this. But this conversation came about from a quote that I saw in your LinkedIn profile, which I'm going to say verbatim here, which was, "We view salespeople as consultants and not pests." So we've all been on the other end of a pesty salesperson who's been chasing us, and it gets awkward, it's a little bit weird.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you first, because it seems like a daft question, but how do you split the difference between a consultant, a pest, and then someone who's just trying really hard, I guess, and hustling and following up, but they're essentially a pest?
Yeah. No, I think it's a fun topic. Honestly, when I saw your email, like we were talking about earlier, I'm pretty excited about it. I think, underneath it all, every customer is looking to gain value from your product or service. And so I think it starts with understanding what value is actually derived from the conversation you're having related to the customer. So I think, often, and with the proliferation, coincidentally, we're at a sales tech conference, but with the proliferation of sales technology, it's now even easier for sales professionals to, send emails, send in mails. And I've worked for companies that have been part of that change. But I think as a result, we've sort of increased the possibility of pests, right, rather than consultants. And I think if you think about a consultant, they actually have your best interests in terms of your business, versus a pest is really just, constantly, incessantly sending messaging that actually may not add any value. So overall, I would say a consultant thinks about every interaction as a potential to add value to the potential customer.
So could we split pest from consultant and put spam down the middle of this? Is that one way to describe a pest, that they are proactive? And because all the sales tool, and there's companies here that enable, rightly or wrongly, they enable salespeople to act more like marketers, to send 500 emails that are somewhat automated, that are somewhat personalized. And I don't know about you, and you can tell me your thoughts on this, but when I get an email that I know hasn't been bespokely written from me and it's from a sales professional, it's a massive instant turn off for me. It's acceptable for marketing because they're sending to 10,000 people. But it frustrates me because I feel that the salesperson's biggest advantage in the marketplace and their ability to differentiate themselves comes from this personalization, not spam.
Yes. Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I was fortunate enough to work at Responsys prior to the acquisition of Oracle. And so, we were really lucky at that stage to connect with the corporate executive board. And we got very hands-on training and coaching from that organization around how to use the challenger sale methodology. And I think if there was one thing that I took away from that experience was that really the consultant is using commercial teaching, right? He's using every potential conversation point to challenge the status quo of the existing business. And
what's an example of that? Because I think a lot of my audience will have heard the challenger sale, a smaller percentage will have read it, and even a smaller percentage will have implemented it. So getting really practical with this, what would be an example of that?
Yeah, so, we've implemented it at Datanize, where I lead the sales team there. And, I think about today's organizations, whether they're sales or marketing. You see a lot of organizations historically use employee size and revenue to determine territory planning to determine account selection, to determine prioritization. And so this very traditional model of really like the number of employees and the amount of revenue a business generates, people use those two values to do everything.
Yeah.
And so in reality, I think you and I would agree when a business goes from 499 employees to 501 employees, this dramatic change and shift in their business is not a reality, right? So, at Data and I's, we're changing the status quo and moving people to a new outcome. And so that concept in the challenger sale is really described as the reframe, which is often misunderstood. But what the reframe really is challenging their existing systems and processes that are the status quo with a potential way of doing something differently that would actually generate more revenue, more customers, and more value for their business. But that comes from understanding their business in some respects better than they do, because as consultants, you're speaking to more people that are similar to their peers than they are, because they're likely not engaged with their peers on a regular basis. You have conversations with their peers as the sales professional each and every day.
So again, I want to get super practical, and I don't know if you can give a specific example of one of your team or that you've put across. Obviously, some of it might be confidential, the data, the elements of it. But what's an example of using insights from a series of accounts or from a specific vertical or an industry? What would be an example of using those insights to engage with a potential new customer?
Yes. So, we're at the Revenue Summit, right? We've got a lot of folks here selling to technology companies. Some of them may have proverbially, crossed the chasm into the next industry. So they're now selling into insurance, or they're selling into companies that are in real estate. And so they're trying to understand, who to contact first and what they should say. And so they'll use, as I said, very primitive sort of measures to understand where they should focus. If they could understand those technology choices, so meaning what technology decisions has an organization made and in what order, and that leads to a level of sophistication, they could actually prioritize based on existing purchases. So this sort of technographic map, which is what we are challenging with, really forms the basis of where the team that I lead create value, become consultants, and ultimately create a better buying experience for the people that are interacting with us every day.
So that is literally, if I've got this right, tell me if I'm wrong, but that is very literally, you could potentially hire a consultant to do that job of gathering that industry data, sussing out when the best time to implement different products are, where you kind of fit down the pipeline of those products as well. Is this what sales should always have been, or is this what it's had to evolve into? Because that clearly is a far more sophisticated role. You need far more business acumen to be able to put that role into practice and to thrive in it, versus being able to pick up a phone 500 times a day and cold call people.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think you're onto something. I think it's sales has come to a point where the buyer is now, and this was the customer is the center of everything back in 2012 and 13 and probably 14. I think the buyers got to a point where they actually can educate themselves to the extent where they can go look at peer reviews, they can go look at technology reviews, they can ping a colleague. There's a lot of things that they can do beyond just visit the website, right? And so being that we've got to that point, it's our job as a sales professional to help them educate themselves. And so I think really that comes down to a deal size, and so there is a contract value, your average selling price, that will dictate the level of sophistication and the level of complexity related to how much you are a consultant versus if you are selling $50 ads on the Thursday radio station. I mean, that conversation can only go so many different ways, and it's probably not worth the time to invest in understanding every single interaction. So I would say that contextual conversation and creating value as a consultant likely starts at a minimum of $10,000. Anything below that, from a deal size perspective, probably isn't worth the investment.
So let me ask you this then, Daniel. How do you ramp up your sales team from, tell me, if do you bring on brand new salespeople or do you bring on experienced salespeople?
Bit of both. I've seen success with promoting teams internally from the SDR role into an account executive role. I try to optimize for that because I'm a firm believer in the SDR team being a farm team for the account executive team. I've seen both from a quantitative and qualitative standpoint that team outperform externally hired reps. So I always try to do that, but sometimes there is a need to hire externally, and we do that.
Okay, that makes total sense. So if you're bringing someone, we'll use the SDR example.
Sure.
You're bringing someone as SDR. You're I don't know if you want to use the word promote, but you're moving them to, well, we'll say shifting. We're shifting them to an AE position.
Yep.
How do you get them to have this business knowledge, this business acumen, this ability to be a consultant? How do they make that leap from SDR of, clearly SDR is more important than just booking meetings. It's the first step. It's the first premise. It's the first impression that the customer gets a lot of the time, or the potential customer. So I don't want to dumb it down.
Yeah.
But for the example, how do you get them from booking meetings to being a true consultant?
Yeah, so I think you're on to a topic that we could probably do about 3 more podcasts on. But I would probably summarize it as I see a lot of organizations failing in this area.
Yeah.
A lot of them try to take the learnings of what they've seen in the SDR role and then move individuals over to an account executive position without the foresight into the roles are very different.
Yep.
You stepped around that in a very PC way and you did it nicely, but
I don't want to. I know there's a good chunk of my audience who are SDRs and the majority are AEs, so I don't want to offend anyone.
Well, for the folks that are listening that are on both sides of that fence, I would challenge the organization to set up a system whereby the SDR organization's actually exposed to scenarios and learning that replicate the account executive position. So what I mean by that is, we've set up, and this is the 3rd time I've done this, a compensation plan where the SDR is not just involved in setting up that first initial appointment, rather they're also involved in nurturing that conversation to a second call, which involves a set of give and take steps between the buyer and the seller. And the SDR is actually compensated to do that. So there's a vested interest in being more involved in the conversation beyond just that initial phone call.
Makes sense.
So that helps to align the SDR into understanding it's more than just an appointment. But then I would also say that they're actually compensated based on a dollar value of pipeline versus just a purely activity-driven number of opportunities.
Yeah.
So when the SDR actually takes ownership of a pipeline number, so a dollar value associated to the business, and they know that conversion number, that's a very powerful position to be in because, if we all think about our account executives, they have a quota, and that quota is a dollar value each month. So it prepares them to actively think about, how to manage a pipeline number, which is very similar to, a quota carrying rep. So for the folks listening, I would challenge your leadership team and ask them what steps have you put in place to ensure that people moving from the SDR to AE role are actually effectively set up to make that transition and not trying to do it all in 3 weeks because it just doesn't work.
And so I think you may have answered my question here already, but when you're making that leap from SDR, however we want to describe it, and it seems awesome the way you've got it set up there. You've got an internal pipeline of potential AEs at this point. We're making that shift. Is it just experience that an AE needs to have that business acumen to be able to have these consultative conversations, or do you have internal documents that give what questions we should be asking, or do you have internal documents of insights that are industry specific that the whole team shares together? What I'm trying to get at is, if there's someone listening to the show now, they know and they can see, they can feel that sales is shifting even more. It probably always has been, since you first got involved with it. It's been shifting towards a consultative place. It always should have been there, potentially. How does someone listening who doesn't have the support of someone like yourself, how do they go about becoming a true consultant? What do they need to put in place? And what do they need to do?
So there's this concept of the 10,000 hours, right? Like we can all become experts in a field of 10,000 hours. Thankfully, I'm not an origami specialist, although I would love to be. That's definitely on the list. What I would say is that, consultants are consultants because they understand the role and the expectations and the responsibilities of the individual they're having a conversation with probably better than the individual does themselves.
Yeah.
Well, how does that happen? That's a result of 10,000 hours if you really can, or you can speed that process up, right? So right now we're going about a pretty instrumental change at Data&Eyes, and I think we'll see a lot of this transpire over the next 12 months. And so another challenge for anyone listening on the call, you absolutely want to begin this change. Now we're in an era where conversation intelligence actually becomes a part of the technology environment, but also the onboarding environment. And so as a result of we've implemented Chorus. We use Chorus to record all conversations, but also transcribe all conversations. So using that platform, we've been able to dissect, the 10 key calls that people should listen to, whereby there are, challenger sale moments that an individual is put in a position where there is the status quo in place. They ask the right questions, and perhaps in a couple of those examples, they ask the wrong questions. And that way, the sales rep, the sales professional coming on board or moving into that account executive role can essentially fast track those 10,000 hours and understand what questions to ask and when, and what questions to not ask ever, and not do those.
Let's touch on that then. Is there anything that came up in, because this is data collection that you're doing here, which is amazing.
Yeah.
Is there anything that came up that you thought, this should work, but it doesn't?
Yeah. I mean, the beauty of psychology is we're still trying to figure it out, right? So I think there's absolutely a number of calls that I've listened to where I expected a certain outcome, and the outcome, wasn't the one that we expected. But I think...
Is there any specifics that you can think of off the top of your head, just out of interest?
Yeah, I think related to pricing is very interesting. Pricing conversations usually flow a pretty traditional path. After doing a lot of them, you get to a level of comfort where as long as you're asking the right questions ahead of that commercial conversation, you can usually gauge the outcome in sort of one or two or three places. But occasionally, you'll see scenarios where the slightly phrased question of not asking for the immediacy of time, so getting a contingent confirmation on a deal closing today will result in a completely different outcome, right? And so if we were able to get this decision done today, is a very different outcome than if we were able to get this decision. And so, what will happen is just adding that word today will change the point where you actually will get the deal done, or you'll send the email and you never hear from them again. And you just relegated yourself to Pest.
Nice. So I love this. So, because this is where clearly marketing has been through a lot of this already, of the data. And I feel like salespeople, again, the biggest assets to the world of business is conversations, and it's insights, and it's relationships. And obviously the platform you mentioned before, and there's a whole bunch of them, and there's a couple that are here at the show today. They are allowing us to have this data that we've never had access to before. And I don't know why we haven't had access to it before, because it seems like such a simple process.
It does.
So yeah, that's probably a conversation to have you back on in the future at another time.
Happy to, yeah.
But with that, Daniel, I've got a couple of questions to ask everyone that comes on the show.
Please.
So first one, what is one kind of like book or a resource or a tool that you'd recommend to the Salesman Podcast audience?
So it's by Paul Adams. It's called Grouped. It's not a New York Times bestseller, but often the best books aren't. So check it out. Amazon, part of the Intercom team. Really interesting guy in product, and just looks at how people make decisions, how social networks are constructed. It's called Grouped. Paul Adams, $12.
Amazing. Well, we'll link to that in the show note to this episode over at salesmanpodcast.com. And one final question that I ask everyone that comes on the show, and that is, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at sales? Yeah,
so I was quoted on Sales Hacker's blog recently of being 22. I don't know what I was doing at 22, so
I was an idiot at 22. Yeah, I don't want to look back at that point.
I definitely was not sitting here. But what I will say is emotional intelligence is the best investment anyone can do as they're in sales, if they want to get into sales. Read the book Emotional Intelligence 2.0, so I'm going to give two book recommendations. But, I think that's the one area where you can see someone who's 23, 24, 25 and they act like they're 35, and they present themselves like they're 35. And so I couldn't stress the value of investing in not just your intelligence, but also emotionally how you handle yourself in conversations. I did a terrible job of doing that at 22, and so I really wish I read that book.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think most people could potentially look back and make that realization, and perhaps some of it is experience as well. Perhaps that you have to go through those university parties and shenanigans to get to a point of maturity out the other end. But it's a fantastic book, so we'll link to that in the show notes as well.
Yep.
And with that, Daniel, tell us for all the SDRs listening who
Yeah.
want to learn to become more consultative and gather these insights, and for everyone else listening as well who's super excited about this data that we just talked about that can fundamentally change sales, I think, in the next 4 or 5 years.
Agreed.
Tell us where we can find out more about you and everything that you're up to.
Yeah. So you can find me on Twitter. I have an unusual Twitter handle called Gaijin Dan, so GAIJINDAN. If you're curious, that's Japanese for foreign person, because I'm usually a foreign person. And you can find me on the white pages of the internet, otherwise known as LinkedIn. Just search Daniel Barber. And you can also send me an email, daniel@dardaneyes.com.
Amazing stuff. Well, we'll link to all of that again in thesalesmanpodcast.com. And with that, Daniel, I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Thanks again, mate.
Cheers, man.
Pleasure.